It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. And since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Hi, neighbor. Well, I don't know whether to be extremely proud or extremely embarrassed, but when we decided at the end of last year that we were going to do a series about being good neighbors, that immediately came to my mind, and I think everybody's mind, and so Aaron and I worked on that and put that together, and so I kind of have mixed feelings about that. But, yeah, good. Yeah. So all of you do probably, right? Yeah, so. Well, today we're starting a new series. If you haven't figured it out by now, we're starting a new series called The Neighborhood. And it's all about how do we live our lives as Jesus called them to live out. For those of you who have been here, you know that we had just finished a series called Believe. And we were talking about the Gospel of John. And John calls us to believe in Jesus, believing that Jesus is the Christ, the one who came and died for us and rose to new life so that we can be saved. And if you believe in Jesus, He calls us to do some things. And that's what this neighborhood series is all about. For the next 5 weeks, we'll be talking about us as neighbors, as Christians. We have a problem in our culture, in our society, and I think probably in our world. And the problem is isolation. And while we're more connected through electronics than we've ever been before in the history of mankind, I mean, literally, we can talk, we are right now as we're live streaming on Periscope. Anybody from around the world can check our services in real time right now. Incredibly, incredibly connected all over the world immediately. When I was a kid, I remember them talking about one day your phone not only will be able to, I don't even know if they talked about cordless, but one day you'll be able to not only at your phone talk to the person, but you'll be able to see them too. And I thought, no way, that's not happening. And now we know that happens all the time. In fact, riding down the road, I watch people doing it on their phones right there in the car. While we're more connected than we've ever been in the history of mankind, so often because of our connectivity with the outside world, we remain isolated in real life. And so that isolation is a huge, huge problem. Carrie Nieuwhof is a kind of a leader in Christian thought and idea, said that while solitude is an incredible gift from God, and it is, if you ever have had the opportunity just to kind of get on your knees in your own private place and commune with God, solitude is an incredible gift of God. He said also that isolation is a weapon of the enemy. I read a story about a lady named Adele Gabry. I think I'm saying that right, and it's a true story. Adele was a 73-year-old woman, lived in her house for quite a while. You know, had knew her neighbors, but as she got older and her kids moved off, you know, she became more and more isolated to the point where some of her neighbors started to notice that she wasn't doing a good job taking care of her yard. And so they decided to be good neighbors. What we need to do is go mow her yard. So they kind of set it up where somebody had somebody who knew somebody who would take care of her yard. And so they went and they set it up to where they had a young guy taking care of her yard every day, mowing her yard, or every week or whatever he was, mowing her yard, taking care of their yard, because Adele wasn't able to do it, obviously. Well, a few weeks later, this young kid who was mowing her yard noticed that a pipe had busted in her like kind of one of the outside spigots had busted, and water was going everywhere. So he told the person who hooked him up, you know, Adele's neighbor, that her pipe was broken. And so a couple of people knew somebody at the water place, and they shut the water off. They kind of fixed that because they didn't want her water to be everywhere. Well, they did everything they could to be good neighbors, but what they failed to do was actually see if Adele was all right. And so finally, after some coaxing from some other neighbors, the police went in and they found Adele, her body, and they estimated that she had been dead for 4 years. It's a true story. You can check that out. And I wonder how many of us are like that. We're so isolated in our lives, and some of you would say that no way that can happen. We have family, but there are so many people in our culture, in our society, that are isolated like that. And Jesus recognized this as a problem. And He addresses this. And what we know and what we find out through Jesus, and if we actually begin to live this out, is that although we have a problem, there is a fix. And Christians can change the world. You and I, as followers of Jesus, and it sounds like something that a preacher might say, right? It's like kind of a, hey, rally the troops, or like a coach before the pregame. Hey, we can change the world right here. But I want you to know that this is actually true. That we, as followers of Jesus, those who believe in Him, we can actually change the world. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22 is the very first part of the gospel, the New Testament. Matthew is the very first gospel book. If you don't have a Bible, or don't own a Bible, or don't have a new translation, a modern translation of the Bible, then we would love for you to grab one of those in the pew in front of you and take that as a gift from Snellville Christian Church. We want you to have that. Matthew chapter 22. I'm going to be reading starting in verse 35. Jesus recognized this need that we have for each other. Jesus knew and recognized that relationships are vitally important to who we are as people. In fact, before Jesus was ever born, before Jesus came on the scene in Bethlehem in that manger, when we talk about at Christmas, before that ever happened, Jesus was in a relationship. God, since the beginning of time, was in relationship with Himself. And it's what we call the Trinity. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. God was in relationship with Himself. And He knew that that relationship was not only good for Him, but it was good for us as well. To be part of a community, especially as believers, to gather together. He believed this so much that He said that these kind of relationships, this kind of idea, this kind of being together is incredibly important. In fact, it's one of the most important things that we can do and be as people who believe in Jesus. So, let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 35. Well, let's back up just one verse to the verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that He had silenced the Sadducees, so they were coming, trying to get Jesus, they're kind of trying to trick Him, they're kind of trying to trap Him. We're really smart guys, we'll kind of trip Jesus up with some stuff here. When the Pharisees heard that He had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Him a question to test Him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And He, Jesus, said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and with all of your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And so Jesus said that the most important thing we can do, the great commandment, the number one thing, if there was only one thing that we were called to do, it's to love God with all that we are, our heart, our soul, and our mind. Everything that we are, we're called to love God. And secondly, the thing that is so close to it, the second most important thing that we can do is love people as we love ourselves. This is it. Love God and love people. In fact, that's why we say this all the time. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to come up our drive here to the kind of as you're coming to the back parking lot. If you notice the mural, has anybody noticed the mural that Aaron painted over here? It says, love God and love people on our building. And he's almost finished with that. If you haven't seen that, be sure to come check that out. It's right back here. It's kind of our shed. It was a big, there was a plant there that kind of was on a trellis that broke off. And so now we've got this white barren wall. And so Aaron put this mural up there. It's incredible. But what it says is what we kind of stand for as a church, as a body of believers. We believe that we want to make disciples. We think that's our calling from God, to make disciples who make disciples who make some more. And the way we want to do that is by loving God and loving people. This is the two great commandments that Jesus said. And yet in our society, we are so isolated. And so often, because of our isolation, we miss it. This is important. This is foremost. This is the thing we're called to do as Christians, and yet we don't do it. The first commandment, the great commandment that He mentions there, actually comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 4. Moses, as he was taking his people into the promised land, says these words, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. If you were Jewish, following Moses, and even up to today. This is the verse that you know. This is like the number one thing. It's kind of like John 3:16. Now, I don't know if they would have taken it to their camel races or their whatever they did and, painted on the sign like we see at football games, John 3:16. Did they put Deuteronomy 6? I don't know. But what I do know is that this is a foundational verse in Jewish thought and faith. And the point of this verse is that each and every one of us, each and every person is called to affirm that God is the one that we need to love Him and follow Him and adore Him with all that we are. And it makes sense that Jesus would continue this idea, that Jesus would continue teaching this, that the greatest, the most important thing we can do is to love God with our entire being. But in real terms, how do we do that? The idea for this series, this kind of neighborhood thing, is to be practical. And so my hope is that when we get done with these 5 weeks or even before, that you'll have some things that you can take away, some really key steps. Here's what I need to do, and I need to do this, and then this, and then this. So practically, how do we love God with all that we are? How do we love God with everything? I mean, is it in our church attendance? I mean, that's important, right? I mean, God calls us to gather together. In fact, that's where this word church, this idea of church comes from. It's a gathering of people who love God. I mean, maybe that's it. Well, that's not really it. Maybe it's giving money. The more money we give, it kind of shows that we love God. And so if I have, $5 to my name and I put it in the offering plate, or if I have $100, or, maybe the more we give, the more we love God. But that's not really it either. What about being a good person? I mean, if we are good people, that shows that we love God, right? Or if we're nice people, maybe that's it. This is where it gets difficult when we actually play this out. But it also gets to where we understand where this second part of this commandment comes from. Because this second part of this greatest commandment is tied to the first, in that how we do the second part shows how much the first part actually means to us. The second part of the commandment, as Jesus said to love people, comes from Leviticus 19, verse 18. It says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And so all of those things are important. Church attendance is important. Giving money back. God has given you money. Maybe giving that back to God is absolutely important. How we worship God in this place on Sundays are important. Being nice people, good people, all of those things are important. But the one way for us to really make a difference in our communities, the one way for us to really show that we love God with all that we are, is to live our lives by loving others, expressing our love for others. And so these two commandments, loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves, encompass all of the Old Testament law and prophets. And if we get these two right, then we've kind of got it down. If we get these two commandments right, then we're on the right track for following God as God would have us follow Him. A few months ago, one of our guys asked me, what's the most important verse? And I didn't really know what to tell him. I kind of thought John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son." But now as I've thought about that and as I began studying for this, I think if I were to tell somebody what's the number, if we could eliminate the entire Bible except for one verse, what couple verses maybe would we focus on? And I think it would have to be this: that we're called to love God with everything that we are. Everything that we are in our life, we are called to love God, and likewise, we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. When we begin to get those things right, we begin to understand who we're called to be as followers of Jesus. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 13:8, he said, "Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." I mean, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you've actually done what God commanded in the Old Testament. I don't know how you think about Jesus. A lot of you, when you think about Jesus, you probably think about Mr. Rogers, right? I mean, the cardigan, the nice guy, the sweater, kind of the meek kind of guy. And real quick, just show of hands, is there anybody who never saw a Mr. Rogers episode? Right? So I know you're allowed to raise your hands if you haven't seen it. That's good. Yeah, look, some of you are like, I don't know if I'm sure. Oh, Nina, come on. So, okay, good. Okay, good. So most of you know what I'm talking about, right? So Mr. Rogers is a meek, mild guy. And I think so many people, when we think about Jesus, that's kind of how we think about Him. Kind of this meek guy, this real, just a nice guy. And He's just really all about being nice and friends. But what we need to remember and what we need to think about when we think about Jesus is that Jesus came to start a revolution. Jesus came to change the world. Not a revolution that would overthrow governments with a sword, but one that would change the hearts of men and women everywhere. And that revolution is still going on today. A revolution that you and I get to participate in. And we participate in that revolution by loving God and loving people. By loving God with all that we are and loving our neighbor as ourselves. In that way, Christians can change the world. In Luke chapter 10, this question was posed again, and it leads the questioner to ask, okay, all right, you're saying love God and love my neighbor as myself, but let me ask you, who is my neighbor? And maybe you remember that because it leads into Jesus telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the guy who was asking that question to justify himself. Luke tells us that he asked that to justify himself so that he could begin to feel good about himself. He was looking for a loophole to exploit. And Jesus tells him again about the Good Samaritan, how that person who you think is your enemy, that is your neighbor. And so I think as Christians, we're right to think about anybody that we come into contact with, anybody that we meet at the grocery store, anybody is at the drive-thru window, wherever we are, God would say that person is your neighbor, and you're to love that person as you love yourself. But I think that we have kind of gotten that mind of thinking, and again, that's not wrong thinking, it's right thinking. But I think what we've done is we've kind of taken that idea that everyone is my neighbor, and we've kind of seen that as an out clause to who my neighbor really is. And according to the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's anyone who we come into contact with. That's absolutely true. But shouldn't it at the very least be also those people who are actually my neighbors? Those people that live across the street from me or next door to me. Those people that we come into contact with, pass them on the street or whatever, day after day after day. Well, I think it does. I think it should. It should be that Jesus calls us to love our neighbor. And when He's talking about our neighbor, sure, He's talking about everyone, but at the very least He's talking about those people that we live really close to. Dave Runyon, who wrote the book, The Art of Neighboring, says there is no noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians actually treat their neighbors. Now remember, Jesus said, here are two things that I want you to do. These are the two most important. Number one is to love the Lord your God with all you are. And number two is to love your neighbor as yourself. As Christians, if we hear statements like this, that there's no noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians treat our neighbor, that should be appalling to us. Well, when Jesus said there are only two things that I really want you to focus on, the two most important things are loving God and loving your neighbor, and we're not doing that, then that ought to be a problem. I decided to pose that question to see if that was actually true. Dave Runyon said there's no noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians treat their neighbor. So I thought, is that true in Snellville? Yeah, I don't know. Let me ask. So I emailed Roy Whitehead, who's the chief of police for Snellville. And I asked him if that statement was true. Is there a noticeable difference? And he said that while it would be difficult to answer that question because when they go to crime scenes or when they go to help people or whatever, they don't ask, what their faith background is. He did say, I have seen people of all faiths and no faiths engage in uncomely activities. Now, I had to look up uncomely. Wasn't really sure what that meant. But it's bad, right? Okay, so the chief of police said, no matter who you are, I know that whether you're a Christian, a non-Christian, or any faith in between, then there are people of all faiths and no faiths who have done all sorts of bad things. And that leads me to believe that probably what Dave Runyon says is true. That there's no noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians treat their neighbors. According to Pew Research Center in 2010, nearly 1/3 of all Americans know none of their neighbors by name. 1/3 of Americans don't know any of the names of their neighbors. Isn't that crazy sounding? And Christians, we have to change this. What if we actually did what Jesus said? What if we actually began to love our neighbors? I think that we would begin to see a change in our neighborhood. And each of us, if most of us live in different neighborhoods. Imagine if we began to change each of our neighborhoods one by one by one. I promise that our communities would change. Our city would change. And eventually, we could change the world. So how do we do that? Well, here are some easy steps. And I wanted to try to get us taking some easy steps. Kind of some baby steps going in the right direction. And I know, without a doubt, I know that for some of you, this is so scary. You're thinking, oh my goodness, what is he about to say? I don't want my neighbor to know that I even exist. If I could just kind of close my door. And, I saw a cartoon one time about an extrovert and an introvert. And we have those people living in my house. And the cartoon was somebody was knocking at the door, and the husband was jumping over the couch because he was an extrovert to go see who was at the door because he was so excited at the chance to meet somebody. And the introvert, who was the wife, had dove under the bed hoping that they wouldn't know that she was there. And it's similar. I mean, Carrie's not in this room. I think she's in the nursery, so don't tell her I was telling this. But that's kind of the way it is in my house. I'm so excited to meet somebody new. And she's kind of like, I'd really rather not anybody know that I'm here. And then I know that there are lots of people like that in this room. It's not that you're shy. It's not that you're afraid to meet people. Those kind of things. It's just that it's harder for you. And so this is kind of scary, right? I know that this is kind of scary. I want to know new people. Not everybody does. But Jesus calls all Christians, regardless of our personality type, to love our neighbor. And so now this is just me. I think the very first step is learning the names of your neighbors. So many of you don't even know the names of your neighbors. And I say so many of you, and I'm the same way. I've lived in the house that we live in for just a little over 3 years. And the people across the street, I've gotten their names, but I can't remember. And really, it's kind of like it's been difficult to even try to get to know them. And so it's something that I need to work on. We need to do that so that we can get beyond the place of, oh, there's that person that lives across the street, let me just say hi, to where we can say now, hey, oh, there's Bob. Hey, Bob, how you doing? In the hopes that knowing that name, so we can say, hey, Bob, Lisa, hey, Bob, how are things going in your life? Hopefully, we can begin to love our neighbor enough to where that person begins to share. Well, I'm struggling. My son is struggling with some illness, or my mom has been sick, or we've kind of hit a financial snag, or whatever it is, so that we can begin to build relationships and love our neighbor as ourselves. When we make the effort, I believe when we make the effort to know the names of at least to know the names of our neighbors, it's going to lead us to getting us to know more about them so that we can love them. And when we get there, we're in a great position to begin to play crucial roles in the lives of our neighbors as someone who actually cares for them. This is what loving your neighbor looks like. Now, what I don't want you to think about when I say these kind of things is that my neighbor across the street, who I don't really remember their names, or your neighbor who you don't know, that I'm asking you to take on a project. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that my hope is that as followers of Jesus, that you will actually love and care for your neighbor enough that you want to build a relationship. Not to change their lives, but to begin to love that person. And so here is something real easy. Step one is your neighborhood grid. In your seat, in your pew, there were enough for each family to have one of these. Does everybody have one of these? Kind of hold it up so I can make sure that everybody has one of these, right? Everybody's got one. Okay? So this is your neighborhood grid. I want every family to take one of these. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'm gonna help anyway. So that middle house, the house right there in the very middle of the grid, that's your house. Now, what I want you to do, now this is not, you can't change the world unless you know your family, your neighbors' names, right? So what I want you to do is begin to fill in the names of the people who live around you. Now a couple people have said, nobody lives behind me. There's a supermarket there. Or my house, actually at my house there's a hill, and the neighbors are like, there's no way, I never see the people behind me. So if that's the case with you, then just don't do that. Do the 5 that are three in front and 1 on either side. But begin to know the names of your neighbors. Now, what you're going to do, if you were to go over across the street and ask your neighbor, what's your name again? You're going to forget. So remember their name, and as soon as you get home, put this under your refrigerator or somewhere where you can see it often, and write their name in that box. In this way, we begin to know our neighbors. Now, some of you are like me, and names aren't easy to remember. All of you, at one time, I got to know you, and I promise I had to ask you your name 5 or 6 times. It's not because I don't love you. I do. It's because there's other stuff going on in my mind, and it goes in and out. And there's a lot of loose stuff in there, and if I shake my head too hard, it'll fall right out. So some of you are like me. So you need to write that down. And so that's what I want you to do. Starting this week is to begin to go and get the names of your neighbors. Now, it's going to be hard. For some of you, you've lived in your house for 10 years, and your neighbors have lived across the street for 7, and you don't know their names. So this is kind of humbling, right? So what you have to do is you have to go over, and you have to knock on your door, and you humble yourself. And you say, hey, listen, I just wanted to, you could even blame it on me. My preacher's an idiot, and he said he wants us to do this. And so here's this, I apologize. I have forgotten your name. And I want to get to know you a little bit better. What's your name again? Okay, Bill and Sue. Right, okay, so we write that down. So that's your name. So I want you to do that as this week. And I'm going to ask you next week, how's it going? And for the next 5 weeks, my hope is that you'll begin to fill this out as you go through. So that's part 1. Step 2 is, I have totally lost my place and where I am. All right, step 2 is your neighborhood grid is step 1. Step 2 is this little brochure right here. Everybody hold it. Everybody got a brochure. Every family gets one of these. The outreach team did this, and I want to congratulate them. What a great job they did on this. What this is easy ways for you to kind of get past that awkward stage, right? So you go knock on the door, and you don't just say, hey, my preacher's weird. You actually have something, a plate of cookies, or you want to invite them to a party, or you want to invite them to dinner, or something like that. These are just ways for you to begin to get to know your neighbor. So maybe to soften the blow of going to ask your neighbor who's lived there for 6 years what their name is, you bring some cookies, or you invite them to dinner, or you have a party, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit. Maybe you want to have a party. I don't know how many of you remember back in the fall, in October, we had a fall festival at Schuyler's Mill, which is the neighborhood right just next door to us here. And what we did is we had blow-ups. There was like 3, the bouncy house kind of things, and there was food going on the grill. My hope is that some of you will begin to do that in your neighborhood. And I already know of 2 families that are doing that together in their neighborhood, where they're going to have a party. And it's an opportunity for you to go, hey, listen, we haven't really met, or we met that one time and I forgot your name, but I want to invite you to our party, which is going to be, 3 weeks on the Saturday night, and we're going to have some fun and do something like that. Now, it doesn't have to be as big as what we did at Schuyler's Mill, where we had all of that stuff going on. But it can be. In fact, the outreach team and I, there's lots of people on the outreach team. Carly leads that. If you're not too embarrassed, Carly, raise your hand, and everybody look at Carly. So, if you have questions or you need help, what we have talked about, and I don't know how much this is going to cost, so I don't know how much of this we'll be able to do, but we think it would be incredible if you said, I want to have a block party like you had at Schuyler's Mill in my neighborhood. Now, if you want to do that, we'll figure out what's it cost to get a bouncy house, what's it cost to maybe help us, run the grill, and provide food, and have volunteers come to your neighborhood to help you run this party so that you can just simply meet your neighbors. Now, if you want to do that, come see me, and it'll be kind of first come, first serve. If everybody in every neighborhood wanted to do it, we probably would run out of money really fast. But if you want to do that, come talk to me or talk to Carly. These are just some ideas that we've been having as we come through. So we want you to meet your neighbor. You can't be good neighbors if you don't know your neighbor. Now, some of you would say, that's not true. I don't know my next door neighbor. He never talks to me. I never talk to him. I love him because you want it that way, right? We can't be the kind of good neighbor that Jesus calls us to be if we don't know our neighbors, right? It's a little bit different than what some of you are thinking. All right. So I want you to think about your neighborhood not only as some project. I don't want you to think about it as a project at all. I want you to think of your neighborhood as the place where God desires to use you. In fact, I believe it's not a mistake you're there, that you were put there for a purpose. There is a purpose for you being in that neighborhood. In fact, let's read Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. You don't have to turn there. The words are going to be on the screen here. Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27. Paul the apostle was standing in front of men in Athens, and he said this. And he's talking about God, and He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Now remember, Paul's talking to people who don't believe in God at all. So he's kind of throwing this big broad thing out there. And God made from every nation, one man, every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward Him, yet He is actually not far from them. I want to say that again. I kind of went really fast. He says that God has made from one man every nation of mankind on the face of the earth. And then He says this, and this is very profound, and it has to do with you and me. He says, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. It is not a mistake that you were born in this period of time. It's not a mistake that you are as old as you are, that you were born in the place that you were born, that you moved here because your job changed. God planned that. God had a purpose for you and has a purpose for you. And I think that goes beyond not only in what era we live in, but it also goes to where we live. That we are there for that purpose. That there's somebody in your neighborhood that needs you to love them the way Jesus calls us to love our neighbors. That God put us there for that purpose. You and your neighbors were born at this time and place for that purpose. You moved to that neighborhood and you thought it was just a good deal on the house. Right? You thought that man, I've looked everywhere for a rental and this one came up and I guess that's where I'm going. Or the pool was really nice or whatever. No, and maybe those things that's the reason for you, but God put you there to use you in that place, in that time. You live there because God has the hope that you will love Him and love your neighbor. Part of this revolution that Jesus started to change the hearts and minds of our neighbors. We spend lots of time focusing on lots of stuff here at Snellville Christian Church. Sunday morning worship is a big part of what we do. Our community groups are huge. If you're not a part of a community group, my prayer is that you will be part of one because it's how we get to know each other. It's how we help each other grow. Our kids' ministries are huge. It's part of the future of who we are at Snellville Christian Church. But I want to tell you, as important as all of that stuff is, what happens in your neighborhood is just as, or if not more, important than everything else that we do. We're called to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Love God and love people. Jesus was a revolutionary. And my prayer is that each one of us will join Him by doing what He commanded us to do. And so, for the first time I can ever remember, you have homework for next week. And it's your neighborhood grid. Start working on ways to get to know your neighbors so that you can begin to love them. In a moment, we're going to sing a song, and it's kind of our time of reflection. We call it our time of invitation. For some of you, this means just you need to think about what that's going to look like for you in your life and in your neighborhood. For some of you, you want to become a follower of Jesus for the very first time, taking those steps to follow Him. And I can tell you what that looks like. Maybe you want to be baptized. Now is a good time for that as well. So I'm going to say a prayer, and my prayer is that you will begin to take these things to heart as I pray and think about those things in your life. Let's pray together. Father, thank You for loving us and for giving us these commands that seem so easy, yet I know, Father, are so challenging. They're challenging for me, and I know they're challenging for most people. It's loving You with all that we are. Loving You most of the time is easy. Loving You in all areas, in all aspects, in all ways, that's hard. Father, help us with that. But also loving our neighbor as ourselves is incredibly difficult. Father, You know some people are so hard to love, and some of us are not good at loving. And so, Father, I pray that You would help us work through those things. Help us to get to know our neighbors, to take those steps, so that we can actually follow Jesus. And the two most important things He said, which is to love You and to love others. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.